The church bells of Sweetwater Creek rang out across the dusty town square, but Violet Vale stood alone at the altar, her white satin wedding dress collecting dust as the minutes ticked by with no sign of her betrothed. The year was 1875, and being abandoned on her wedding day was perhaps the most humiliating thing that could happen to a young woman in the Wyoming Territory. Violet's hands trembled as she clutched her bouquet of wildflowers, watching the church door with diminishing hope. The whispers from the pews behind her grew louder with each passing minute. Her father, standing rigidly beside her, cleared his throat for the third time, his patience wearing thin. "He isn't coming," someone finally whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Violet felt her world crumbling. Henry Blackstone, the banker's son she'd been courting for nearly 2 years, had promised to make her the happiest woman in the territory. Now she stood before the entire town, a spectacle of rejection and pity. Just as the first tear threatened to spill onto her cheek, the church door swung open. But instead of Henry in his wedding suit, there stood Thomas Everett, his Stetson in hand, boots dusty from the trail. His presence caused a ripple of murmurs through the congregation. Thomas wasn't supposed to be there. He was just passing through town, a cattle driver with a reputation for being as wild as the frontier itself. Their eyes met across the church, and without hesitation, he strode down the aisle, ignoring the shocked faces of the townsfolk. "Miss Vale," he said softly as he reached her, extending his hand. "I believe you deserve better than waiting here any longer." Something in his steady gaze gave Violet courage. Without looking back at the astonished faces of her family and friends, she placed her gloved hand in his, and together they walked out of the church into the bright Wyoming sunshine. "I don't know what I'm doing," Violet admitted as they stepped into the dusty street, the church door closing behind them with a heavy thud. "Neither do I," Thomas replied honestly, his voice low and steady. "But I couldn't bear to see you standing there another minute." Violet barely knew Thomas Everett. He had arrived in Sweetwater Creek 3 weeks prior with a cattle drive and was supposed to be moving on soon. They had exchanged pleasantries exactly twice, once at the general store, and once when he'd tipped his hat to her outside the post office. Yet here she was, walking down the main street of town with him, still in her wedding dress, causing every head to turn. "Why did you do that?" she asked, finally finding her voice as they reached the edge of town. She realized she was still clutching his hand like a lifeline. Thomas stopped and looked at her properly. His eyes were the color of a summer sky, weathered at the corners from years squinting in the sun. "Because no one should be left standing alone like that," he said simply. "Especially not someone as kind as you." "You don't even know me," Violet said, suddenly self-conscious in her elaborate dress. "I know enough. I know you bring flowers to old Mrs. Peterson every Tuesday. I know you help teach the children at the schoolhouse when Miss Franklin is ill. I know you deserve better than what just happened in there." Violet felt her cheeks flush. She hadn't realized he'd been watching her so closely during his short time in town. "Where were you taking me?" she asked, noticing they had walked quite a distance from the church. "Nowhere in particular," Thomas admitted with a slight smile. "Just away from there. But perhaps you'd like to sit for a spell? There's a bench by the creek where you might collect your thoughts." Violet nodded gratefully, and they walked in silence to a small wooden bench overlooking Sweetwater Creek. The sound of running water helped calm her frayed nerves. "I should be mortified," Violet said after a long pause. "The entire town was there to witness my humiliation." "You've nothing to be ashamed of," Thomas replied firmly. "The shame belongs to the man who made promises he couldn't keep." As they sat there, Violet finally allowed herself to cry, the tears she'd been holding back at the altar now flowing freely. Thomas handed her a clean handkerchief without comment, giving her the dignity of her grief. "Do you know why he didn't come?" Thomas asked gently after her tears had subsided. Violet shook her head. "I thought we were happy. He proposed last Christmas, gave me his mother's ring. We had plans." Her voice trailed off as she twisted the gold band on her finger, the one she would now have to return. "Sometimes people aren't who we think they are," Thomas said, his gaze drifting to the water. Something in his tone suggested he spoke from personal experience. "What will I do now?" Violet whispered, more to herself than to him. "I can't go back there today. I can't face them all." "You don't have to," Thomas said. "Not today, anyway. My camp is just outside town. You could rest there, gather your strength before facing the gossip. Violet considered his offer. It was highly improper by any standard, but then again, so was being left at the altar. The thought of returning to her parents' home, of facing their pitying glances and having to explain what she herself didn't understand, was unbearable. "You're leaving soon, aren't you? With the cattle drive?" she asked. Thomas nodded. "Day after tomorrow, heading to Cheyenne, then on to Colorado." Violet made a decision that surprised even herself. "Take me with you." Thomas's eyes widened. "Miss Vale, I don't think you understand what you're asking. The trail is no place for a woman," Violet finished, a newfound determination in her voice. "Perhaps. But it's no place for cowards either, and I refuse to be one. I refuse to hide in shame in this town, where everyone will whisper behind my back for years to come." "It's dangerous," Thomas warned, "and difficult. Not at all the life you've been preparing for." "The life I've been preparing for disappeared the moment Henry decided not to show up at that church," Violet said firmly. "I'm asking for a chance to leave, at least for a little while, to figure out who I am when I'm not defined by this town or by him." Thomas studied her face for a long moment. "You're serious." "Completely," he sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his sun-bleached hair. "Your father will likely come after me with a shotgun." "I'm 21 years old," Violet replied. "Old enough to make my own decisions, even foolish ones." A hint of a smile crossed Thomas's face. "And this might be the most foolish one yet." "Perhaps," Violet agreed. "But it's mine to make." After a long moment of consideration, Thomas nodded. "All right, but there are conditions. You'll need practical clothes, not—" He gestured at her wedding dress. "And you'll need to pull your weight. A cattle drive isn't a pleasure trip." "I understand," Violet said, already mentally cataloging what she would need. "I can ride, and I'm not afraid of hard work." "We leave at dawn the day after tomorrow," Thomas said. "If you're serious about this, meet me at the eastern edge of town. If you don't show up, I'll understand." Violet nodded, feeling a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. "I should go home. There are things I need to do if I'm leaving." "Are you sure you're ready to face them?" Thomas asked. "No," Violet admitted, "but I need to try. I owe my parents an explanation at least." Thomas stood and offered her his hand once more. "Then I'll walk you back." As they made their way back toward town, Violet knew people were watching from windows and doorways. But somehow, with Thomas beside her, their stares didn't cut quite as deeply. "Thank you," she said softly as they approached her parents' house, "for not letting me stand there alone." "You're stronger than you know, Miss Vale," Thomas replied. "You would have managed just fine without me." Violet wasn't so sure, but his confidence in her gave her the courage to face what waited behind her front door. "Until dawn, day after tomorrow," she said, removing the ring from her finger and placing it in her pocket. Thomas tipped his hat. "Until then." As Violet watched him walk away, she felt a curious sense of possibility replacing the despair that had threatened to consume her at the altar. Life had not turned out as she'd planned, but perhaps, just perhaps, it might turn out better than she'd imagined. Her parents' reaction was exactly as she expected: shock, dismay, and desperate attempts to convince her to reconsider. Her mother wept, lamenting the scandal and what people would say. Her father threatened to lock her in her room until she came to her senses. "I'm of age, Father," Violet reminded him calmly. "You can't stop me from leaving." "That cowboy has addled your mind," her father insisted. "You're not thinking clearly after what Henry did." "Perhaps for the first time, I am thinking clearly," Violet countered. "I need to leave Sweetwater Creek, at least for a while." "But to go with a cattle drive? It's unthinkable. No decent woman would consider such a thing," her mother cried. "Then perhaps I'm not a decent woman," Violet replied, surprising herself with her boldness. "Or perhaps decency has nothing to do with following one's heart." Her parents' arguments continued well into the night, but Violet remained resolute. By morning, realizing they couldn't change her mind, they shifted to practical concerns. "At least take your grandmother's pistol," her father said gruffly, "and write to us when you can." Her mother helped her pack practical clothes: riding skirts, sturdy boots, flannel shirts that had belonged to her brother before he moved east. Neither of them mentioned the wedding dress, now hanging forgotten in Violet's closet. "I don't understand your choice," her mother said as she folded a warm shawl. "But I respect your courage." The day before her departure, Violet received an unexpected visitor. Henry's sister, Clara, came to the house, her expression grim. "I thought you deserved to know," Clara said after they were seated in the parlor. "Henry left town with Lucinda Palmer. They've gone to Montana Territory." Lucinda Palmer, the milliner's daughter, was a pretty vivacious girl several years younger than Violet. The news should have devastated her, but instead, Violet felt oddly relieved. "How long?" she asked quietly. Clara looked uncomfortable. 6 months, according to Mother's suspicions. "I'm sorry, Violet. I would have told you if I'd been certain." Violet nodded, taking in this new information. "Thank you for telling me now." After Clara left, Violet walked to the small garden behind her parents' house. The hollyhocks and daisies she had planted were in full bloom, creating a riot of color. She had imagined planting a similar garden at the house Henry had promised to build for her. Now she would be sleeping under the stars instead, following a dusty trail to an uncertain future. Strangely, the thought brought her a sense of freedom rather than despair. That evening, as Violet packed the last of her belongings into a small trunk that would be carried on one of the supply wagons, she heard a soft knock at her bedroom door. "Come in," she called, expecting her mother with another attempt at dissuasion. Instead, her father entered, looking uncomfortable. In his hands was a small leather pouch. "Your mother and I had been saving this for you and Henry," he said, placing the pouch on her bed. "But circumstances being what they are, I think you should take it with you." Violet opened the pouch to find a significant amount of money, more than she had expected her parents could spare. "Father, I can't—" "You can and you will," he interrupted firmly. "The world is a harsh place, Violet. I wish you would stay, but if you're determined to go, at least go with some security." Tears welled in Violet's eyes as she embraced her father. "Thank you," she whispered. "Be careful," he replied gruffly. "And come home when you're ready." That night, Violet barely slept, her mind filled with thoughts of the journey ahead. What was she doing, leaving everything familiar behind to follow a man she barely knew? Was she running away from her problems rather than facing them? Or was this the beginning of something important, something true? Dawn broke clear and golden on the day of her departure. Violet dressed in her riding clothes, braided her long chestnut hair, and tucked her grandmother's small pistol into the pocket of her skirt. With a final glance around her childhood bedroom, she shouldered her satchel and walked downstairs. Her parents were waiting to say goodbye. Her mother pressed a package of food into her hands, and her father helped load her trunk onto their wagon to transport it to the meeting place. The eastern edge of town was already bustling with activity when they arrived. The cattle drive was preparing to move out cowboys mounting horses, chuck wagons being checked one last time, cattle lowing in the distance. Thomas Everett spotted her immediately and walked over, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "You came," he said, a note of surprise in his voice. "I said I would," Violet replied, suddenly aware of how real this moment was. Thomas nodded to her parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Vale, I give you my word that your daughter will be treated with respect and protected on this journey." Her father fixed Thomas with a stern gaze. "See that she is, young man, or you'll answer to me." After a tearful goodbye to her parents, Violet found herself being introduced to the trail boss, a grizzled man named Frank, who regarded her with obvious skepticism. "Everett says you can ride and work," Frank said bluntly. "That true?" "Yes, sir," Violet replied, straightening her shoulders. "I grew up on the frontier. I'm not afraid of hard work." Frank's weathered face softened slightly. "Good, because there's plenty of it ahead. You'll help Cookie with the meals and take your turn at watch like everyone else." "I understand," Violet said, grateful to be treated without condescension. Thomas led her to a sturdy bay mare. "This is Penny. She's even tempered and sure-footed. She'll serve you well." As Violet mounted the horse, she caught sight of several townspeople watching from a distance, no doubt scandalized by her departure. Among them was Reverend Miller, who had been prepared to marry her 2 days ago. His disappointed frown made her momentarily doubt her decision, but then she remembered the hollow feeling of standing abandoned at the altar, and her resolve strengthened. "Ready?" Thomas asked, mounted on his own horse beside her. Violet took one last look at Sweetwater Creek, the only home she had ever known. "Ready," she confirmed. With a series of calls and whistles, the cattle drive began to move, dust rising as the herd of nearly 800 cattle started their long journey east. Violet urged Penny forward, falling into place beside the chuck wagon. "Never had a woman on one of my drives before," said Cookie, the cook, eyeing her curiously from his perch on the wagon seat. He was an older man, with a snow-white beard and kind eyes despite his gruff manner. "Hope you don't expect special treatment." "None whatsoever," Violet assured him, earning a grunt of approval. As the town disappeared behind them, Violet felt a strange mixture of terror and elation. For the first time in her life, she was truly on her own, making her own choices, facing an uncertain future with nothing but her wits and courage to guide her. The first day on the trail was brutally educational. By mid-morning, Violet's muscles were screaming from the unfamiliar strain of riding for hours. By afternoon, the dust had coated her throat and clothes, making each breath an effort. By evening, when they finally stopped to make camp, she was so exhausted she could barely dismount. Thomas appeared at her side, offering a hand. "First day's always the hardest," he said, as he helped her down from Penny. Violet's legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground. "Does it get easier?" she asked, trying to hide her discomfort. A smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Yes and no. Your body gets used to it, but then other challenges arise. Weather, river crossings, the occasional stampede." "Stampede?" Violet repeated, alarmed. "Don't worry," Thomas assured her. "We've got experienced men who know how to handle whatever comes our way." Despite her exhaustion, Violet insisted on helping Cookie prepare the evening meal. She chopped vegetables for the stew, kneaded dough for biscuits, and kept the fire stoked, all under the watchful eye of the old cook. "Not bad," Cookie grudgingly admitted as they served the hungry cowboys. "You've done this before." "I've cooked for my family since I was 12, Violet replied, handing a plate to one of the drovers. After dinner, sitting around the campfire, Violet felt the curious gazes of the men. Some were friendly, others wary, a few downright suspicious of having a woman on the drive. "So you're the girl who got left at the altar," one of the younger cowboys finally said, earning an elbow in the ribs from his companion. "Adam," Thomas warned from across the fire. "It's all right," Violet said, meeting the young man's gaze steadily. "Yes, I am that girl, and now I'm here, making a different choice." Her straightforward answer seemed to satisfy most of the men. As they began to share stories and jokes, the initial awkwardness faded. Violet listened, occasionally contributing to the conversation, and slowly began to feel less like an intruder and more like a part of this unusual community. Later, as the men prepared for sleep, Thomas showed her where she would rest a small tent, set up a modest distance from the main camp, offering her privacy. "It's not much," he apologized, "but it's dry and the bedroll is clean." "It's perfect," Violet said sincerely. "Thank you for everything." Thomas lingered for a moment, looking as if he wanted to say more, but then simply nodded. "Sleep well, Miss Vale. Dawn comes early on the trail." Alone in her tent, Violet finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the day's events. Her muscles ached, her skin was raw from the sun and wind, and her mind whirled with new experiences. Yet underneath the physical discomfort was a curious sense of accomplishment. She had survived her first day. She had taken a step toward building a new life from the ashes of her old one. As she drifted toward sleep, the sounds of the night surrounded her, the soft lowing of cattle, the occasional whinny of horses, the distant howl of a coyote, and the murmured conversations of the men on watch. It was a symphony entirely different from the familiar sounds of Sweetwater Creek, yet strangely comforting in its wildness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but, for now, Violet Vale was exactly where she had chosen to be. The days fell into a rhythm as the cattle drive moved steadily eastward. Violet woke before dawn each morning, helped Cookie prepare breakfast, then rode alongside the chuck wagon, or helped with the drag, keeping the slower cattle moving with the herd. The work was exhausting, but she found herself growing stronger, more capable with each passing day. The cowboys, initially skeptical, gradually accepted her presence. Cookie, in particular, became an unexpected ally, teaching her the tricks of cooking over an open fire and sharing stories of his 30 years on the trail. "Never thought I'd say this," he told her one evening as they washed dishes in a stream. But you're a darn sight more useful than half these cowboys. Don't tell him I said so, though. Thomas Everett, however, remained something of a mystery. He was unfailingly polite, ensuring she had what she needed, occasionally riding beside her to point out interesting sights or give advice. But he maintained a careful distance that left Violet both relieved and, surprisingly, disappointed. A week into the journey, they reached the first major challenge, a river crossing. The water was high from recent rains, the current swift enough to be dangerous. Frank gathered the men to discuss the best approach. Violet listened from the edge of the group, knowing her opinion wasn't sought, but wanting to understand the decision-making. "We'll cross here," Frank finally decided. "The banks are gradual, and there's a decent exit point on the other side. We'll get the chuck wagon across first, then move the herd in sections." Thomas spotted Violet listening and walked over. "Stay with the wagon for this crossing," he advised. "The current's stronger than it looks." "I can handle myself," Violet replied, slightly bristling at being treated differently. Thomas's expression remained serious. "I'm sure you can, but river crossings are dangerous even for experienced hands. We've lost men and cattle both to less challenging waters than these." Violet wanted to argue, but recognized the wisdom in his caution. "All right, I'll stay with Cookie." The river crossing proved every bit as challenging as Frank had anticipated. The lead cattle balked at entering the water, requiring several cowboys to position themselves in the river to guide them. Once the first cattle began to move, the rest followed, but the current caught several younger steers, pulling them downstream. Thomas and two other riders immediately gave chase, riding their horses hard along the riverbank until they could enter the water downstream and intercept the panicked animals. Violet watched from the far bank, her heart in her throat, as Thomas plunged his horse into the churning water. For a terrible moment, both rider and horse disappeared beneath the surface. When they emerged, Thomas was still in the saddle, but his horse was clearly struggling against the current. With remarkable skill, he guided his mount to one of the stranded steers, got a rope around its horns, and began the difficult process of leading it back to shore. By the time all the cattle and men had safely crossed, the sun was setting. They made camp closer to the river than usual, too exhausted to continue further. Thomas's horse had suffered a cut on its leg during the crossing, and Violet found him tending to the animal as she finished helping with dinner. "How is she?" Violet asked, approaching cautiously. Thomas looked up, his face drawn with concern. "The cut's deep, but I don't think it hit anything vital. She'll need a day or two of rest." Violet knelt beside him, examining the horse's leg. "I have some witch hazel in my things. It might help with the swelling." Thomas nodded gratefully. "That would be good, thank you." Violet returned with her small medical kit, which included several herbal remedies she had prepared before leaving Sweetwater Creek. Together, they cleaned and treated the horse's wound. "You handled yourself well today," Violet said as they worked. "That was impressive riding." Thomas shrugged off the compliment. "Just doing what needed doing. We can't afford to lose any cattle, especially not to something as foolish as a river." "Still, it was brave," Violet insisted. "You could have been hurt." Thomas glanced at her, a question in his eyes. "Would that have mattered to you?" The directness of his question caught Violet by surprise. "Of course it would," she replied honestly. "You've been kind to me. I wouldn't want to see you injured." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a softening around his eyes. "You've surprised a lot of people on this drive, Miss Vale. Not many would have had the courage to leave everything behind as you did." "I'm not sure it was courage," Violet admitted, gently applying a bandage to the horse's leg. "Sometimes I think it was more like running away." "There's a difference between running away and running towards something," Thomas said thoughtfully. "Which do you think you're doing?" Violet considered his question seriously. "Both, perhaps, running away from humiliation, from pity, but also running toward, I'm not sure what. Something that's mine, I suppose. A life I choose rather than one that was chosen for me." Thomas nodded, understanding in his gaze. "That sounds like courage to me." Their conversation was interrupted by Cookie calling that dinner was ready. As they walked back to camp together, Violet felt a subtle shift in their relationship, a new ease, a tentative friendship forming. That night, as she lay in her tent, listening to the river's constant murmur, Violet realized something surprising. For the first time since the wedding that wasn't, She had gone an entire day without thinking of Henry Blackstone. The pain of his betrayal was still there, but it had receded, making room for new experiences, new relationships, new possibilities. The next morning brought another surprise. As Violet emerged from her tent, she found Thomas waiting nearby with a small leather-bound book in his hands. "I noticed you looking at the wildflowers yesterday," he said, holding out the book. "Thought you might like this. It's a guide to plants of the Western Territories." Violet accepted the book, touched by the unexpected gift. "Thank you. Where did you get this?" "I picked it up in a bookshop in Denver last year," Thomas explained. "I like knowing what I'm looking at as I travel. Thought you might feel the same." Throughout the day, as they traveled across a rolling landscape dotted with wildflowers and sage, Violet consulted the book, identifying Indian paintbrush, larkspur, and wild lupine. Thomas occasionally rode beside her, pointing out plants he recognized, sharing stories of their medicinal uses or the Native American legends associated with them. By the time they made camp that evening, something had changed between them. The careful distance Thomas had maintained seemed to have diminished, replaced by a genuine camaraderie that made Violet's heart beat a little faster whenever he was near. That night, after dinner had been served and the dishes washed, Violet sat by the campfire sketching some of the flowers she had seen in a small notebook she had brought from home. Thomas joined her, watching quietly as her pencil moved across the page. "You're talented," he remarked, surprising her. Violet smiled, pleased by his praise. "My mother taught me. She always said a lady should have accomplishments." "I imagine she had different accomplishments in mind than driving cattle," Thomas said with a hint of humor. Violet laughed. "Yes, along with embroidery and playing the piano." "Not much call for either out here." "Do you miss it?" Thomas asked more seriously. "Your life in Sweetwater Creek?" Violet considered the question. "I miss my parents. I miss the certainty of knowing what each day would bring." She paused, looking up at the star-filled sky above them. "But I don't miss feeling like my life was already written, with all the chapters decided for me, before I'd even lived them." Thomas nodded, his gaze following hers to the stars. "Freedom has its price." "Yes," Violet agreed softly, "but I'm beginning to think it's worth it." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds and the occasional snore from one of the sleeping cowboys. "May I ask you something personal?" Violet finally ventured. Thomas turned to her, his expression open. "Of course. Why did you help me that day at the church? You barely knew me." Thomas was quiet for so long that Violet thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, meant only for her ears. "I know what it's like to be left," he said simply. "Not at the altar, but I know what it's like to have someone you trusted walk away." Violet waited, sensing there was more to his story. "I was engaged once," Thomas continued, his gaze on the dying fire. "Back in Texas, 3 years ago. Her name was Sarah. We had plans to start a ranch together, raise horses. Then the war came." "You fought?" Violet asked gently. Thomas nodded. "For the Confederacy, though I had no love for their cause. In Texas, you didn't get much choice. I was gone for 2 years. When I came back, Sarah was married to someone else, a man who'd stayed behind, who hadn't seen the things I'd seen." "I'm sorry," Violet said, understanding his pain in a way she couldn't have before her own experience with betrayal. Thomas shrugged, but the gesture couldn't hide the old hurt in his eyes. "It was a long time ago, but when I saw you standing there in that church, something in your face reminded me of how I felt coming home to find Sarah gone. I couldn't just walk by." His honesty touched Violet deeply. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee. "I'm glad you didn't." Their eyes met over the dying embers of the fire, and Violet felt a flutter of something new and unexpected in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames before them, and everything to do with the man beside her. The moment was broken by Frank calling out the watch assignments for the night. Thomas was on second watch, which meant he would need to sleep soon. "I should let you rest," Violet said, withdrawing her hand. Thomas nodded, rising to his feet. "Good night, Miss Vale." "Violet?" She corrected him with a smile. "I think after everything, you might call me Violet." A slow smile spread across his face. "Good night, Violet. Sleep well." As she watched him walk away toward his bedroll, Violet realized with a start that her heart was racing. Was she developing feelings for Thomas Everett? It seemed impossible too soon after Henry, too quick to be anything real. And yet, there was no denying the way her pulse quickened when he was near, or how his smile could brighten even the most grueling day on the trail. "Careful now," she whispered to herself as she made her way to her tent. "One broken heart is quite enough." But as she drifted off to sleep that night, it was Thomas's face, not Henry's, that filled her dreams. The cattle drive continued its slow progress eastward, crossing vast prairies where the horizon seemed to stretch forever. They passed through small settlements where the arrival of so many cattle and cowboys was the most exciting event in months. In these towns, Violet drew curious, often disapproving stares from the local women. But she found she cared less and less what others thought of her unconventional choice. 2 weeks into the journey, they encountered a small band of Cheyenne hunters. Frank, who spoke some of their language, exchanged greetings and news. The Cheyenne leader warned them of a gang of cattle rustlers operating in the territory ahead, white men who had been stealing from both settlers and Native Americans alike. That evening, Frank gathered everyone to discuss the warning. "We'll double the night watch," he decided, "and keep the herd tight during the day. No strays left behind." The atmosphere in camp grew tense as they moved into the dangerous territory. Violet noticed Thomas checking his rifle more frequently and keeping closer to her during the day's ride. "Do you think we'll encounter these rustlers?" she asked him as they rode side by side, the chuck wagon creaking along ahead of them. "Hard to say," Thomas replied, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Rustlers typically avoid large, well-armed drives like ours, but these ones sound bold if they're stealing from the Cheyenne." 3 days later, their vigilance was tested. It was just before dawn, the sky beginning to lighten in the east, when Violet was awakened by shouts and gunfire. She grabbed her grandmother's pistol and rushed from her tent to find the camp in chaos. A group of mounted men had attempted to cut off part of the herd during the night. The cowboys on watch had spotted them, and a firefight had ensued. As Violet watched in horror, one of the younger cowboys, Adam, fell from his horse, clutching his shoulder. Without thinking, Violet ran to him, dropping to her knees beside his wounded form. "Help me get him to the wagon," she called to a nearby cowboy, who looked momentarily stunned to see her in the middle of the fighting. Together, they half-carried Adam to the relative safety of the chuck wagon. Violet tore open his shirt to reveal a bullet wound in his shoulder, bleeding profusely. "Get my medical kit from my tent," she ordered, pressing a clean cloth against the wound to slow the bleeding. Years of frontier living had taught her basic medical skills, and she focused on those now, pushing aside her fear. The gunfire continued for several minutes before the rustlers retreated, driven off by the determined defense of the cowboys. As calm returned to the camp, Violet remained focused on treating Adam's wound, cleaning it as best she could with whiskey and binding it tightly. Thomas found her there, his face grim with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "I'm fine," Violet assured him, though her hands trembled slightly. "Adam's been shot, but I think he'll recover if infection doesn't set in." Thomas looked from the wounded cowboy to Violet, admiration clear in his eyes. "You've got steady nerves, Violet Vale." She managed a shaky smile. "Not so steady, but I couldn't just hide in my tent." Frank joined them, his weathered face lined with worry. "How's the boy?" "He needs proper medical attention," Violet replied. "Is there a town nearby? A doctor?" Frank nodded. "There's a settlement about a half-day's ride from here. I'll send 2 men to take him there." As they prepared a wagon to transport Adam, Violet helped make him as comfortable as possible for the journey. The young cowboy was pale from blood loss, but conscious. "Thank you, Miss Vale," he said weakly as she adjusted the blanket around him. "Never thought I'd be glad to have a woman on the drive, but I am now." Violet squeezed his good hand. "You'll be fine, Adam. Just rest." After Adam had been sent to the settlement with 2 cowboys as escorts, the drive continued with increased caution. Frank decided to alter their route slightly, hoping to avoid further encounters with the rustlers. That evening, the mood in camp was subdued. One of their own had been wounded, and everyone felt the weight of that reality. Violet sat by the fire, staring into the flames, the events of the morning replaying in her mind. Thomas joined her, offering a cup of coffee. "You should be proud of what you did today," he said as she accepted the drink. I only did what anyone would have done, Violet demurred. Not anyone, Thomas countered. It takes a special kind of courage to run toward danger rather than away from it. Violet looked up at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. You did the same. You all did. It's different for us, Thomas said. It's expected. For you. He trailed off, seeming to search for the right words. Violet, you continue to amaze me. His words warmed her more than the coffee or the fire. I'm discovering that I'm stronger than I thought, she admitted. Back in Sweetwater Creek, I never had the chance to find out what I was capable of. And now? Thomas asked softly. Violet met his gaze steadily. Now, I think perhaps I'm capable of quite a lot. Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a softening, a vulnerability that made Violet's breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might reach for her hand or say something more personal. Instead, he simply nodded, a smile touching his lips. I never doubted it, he said. The next few days passed without incident. They received word that Adam had reached the doctor and was expected to recover fully, news that lifted everyone's spirits. The landscape began to change as they moved eastward, the open prairie giving way to more varied terrain, with scattered woodlands and rolling hills. Violet found herself riding beside Thomas more often than not, their conversations ranging from practical matters of the cattle drive to more personal sharing of their pasts and hopes for the future. What will you do when we reach Cheyenne? Thomas asked one afternoon as they rode alongside a bubbling creek. Violet had been pondering this question herself. I'm not sure, she admitted. I have some money saved. Perhaps I'll find work there for a while. As what? Thomas asked, genuinely curious. I could teach, Violet suggested, or work in a shop, or... She hesitated, then shared a dream she'd held close. I've always wanted to open a small apothecary. My grandmother taught me about medicinal plants and preparations. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. You'd be good at that. You have a healer's hands. What about you? Violet asked. Will you continue with the cattle drives? Thomas was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. Not forever. I've been saving to buy some land. A small ranch, nothing fancy. Somewhere I could raise horses. Like you planned with Sarah, Violet said softly. Similar, Thomas acknowledged, but different too. Those dreams belonged to a younger man. I've changed since then. Violet understood what he meant. Her own dreams had changed since leaving Sweetwater Creek. The life she had envisioned with Henry, running a household, raising children in the small town, now seemed confining rather than comforting. Sometimes I think about staying on the move, she confessed, just following the trails, seeing new places. There's something freeing about not being tied to one spot. Thomas smiled at her, the sun highlighting the gold in his brown hair. The wandering life has its appeal, though eventually most folks want somewhere to call home. Home. The word stirred complex emotions in Violet. Sweetwater Creek had been home her entire life, yet she felt no urgent desire to return there. Home, she was beginning to realize, might be less about a place and more about the people with whom you shared your journey. As they made camp that evening by a small lake, the mood was more relaxed than it had been since the Rustler attack. Someone produced a harmonica, and music filled the air as the cowboys shared songs and stories around the campfire. Violet, finished with her cooking duties, sat at the edge of the circle, enjoying the camaraderie that had developed over the weeks of travel. She had gone from being an oddity the woman left at the altar to being an accepted and valued member of their unusual community. May I join you? Thomas asked, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. Violet smiled in welcome, accepting one of the cups. Of course. They sat together, listening to a cowboy named Mitch play a melancholy tune on his harmonica. The music drifted across the still waters of the lake, hauntingly beautiful in the gathering twilight. I've been thinking, Thomas said after a while, his voice low enough that only Violet could hear, about what comes next. Violet turned to look at him, curious. And what have you decided? Thomas met her gaze, something earnest and vulnerable in his eyes. That depends partly on you. Violet's heart began to race. On me? Yes, Thomas said simply. Violet, I know it hasn't been long, and your heart is still healing from what happened, but I find myself caring for you, more than I expected, more than might be wise." The directness of his confession took Violet's breath away. She had felt the growing connection between them, had caught herself watching him when he wasn't looking, thinking of him before sleep claimed her each night. But she hadn't dared hope he might feel the same. "Thomas, You don't need to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know that when we reach Cheyenne, I'd like to stay near you, if you'll allow it, to see if what I'm feeling might grow into something you could share." Violet looked into his honest blue eyes and felt something shift inside her, like a key turning in a lock. The pain of Henry's betrayal was still there, but it had been transformed into something else, a wisdom, a caution perhaps, but not a barrier to new possibilities. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I care for you too, Thomas. I'm not sure what that means yet, but I'd like the chance to find out." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the prairie, warm, illuminating, full of promise. Without words, he reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. They sat that way for a long time, hands joined, watching the stars emerge above the lake, while the harmonica played on. In that moment, Violet felt a certainty she hadn't experienced since leaving Sweetwater Creek. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges lay ahead, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The following week brought both beauty and hardship to the cattle drive. They passed through a region of stunning wildflower meadows that had Violet constantly consulting Thomas's plant guide. But they also faced a violent thunderstorm that scattered cattle and left everyone soaked to the skin for 2 miserable days. Through it all, the connection between Violet and Thomas deepened. They were discreet, mindful of propriety even in their unconventional circumstances. But the other cowboys weren't blind to the growing affection between them. Violet caught knowing smiles and occasional winks, especially from Cookie, who had appointed himself something of a guardian to her. "Everett's a good man," the old cook told her one morning as they prepared breakfast together. "Steady, trustworthy, not like some of these young bucks who'd leave a girl high and dry." "I know," Violet said, unable to hide her smile. "I'm being careful, Cookie. I won't rush into anything." The old man nodded approvingly. "Good. Your heart's still mending. But when it's ready..." He let the thought hang unfinished as he turned his attention back to the biscuits. They were now just 5 days from Cheyenne, and talk in the camp often turned to what awaited them, their hot baths, real beds, whiskey, and other entertainments that made Violet blush when mentioned. For her part, she found herself both anticipating and dreading their arrival. Cheyenne would mark the end of this journey that had changed her so profoundly, but also the beginning of something new and uncertain. One evening, Thomas suggested they ride to a nearby hilltop to watch the sunset. With Cookie's conspiratorial blessing, they slipped away from camp just before dusk. The hilltop offered a spectacular view of the rolling landscape they had traversed, the cattle drive visible as a dark mass in the valley below. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and golds. "It's beautiful," Violet breathed, dismounting from Penny. Thomas tied both horses to a nearby tree and joined her at the edge of the hilltop. "I thought you might like the view. It helps remind me why I love this life, even when it's hard." They stood side by side, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. In the golden light, Thomas looked younger, the lines of weariness and worry smooth from his face. "Violet," he said after a comfortable silence, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." She turned to face him, her heart picking up its pace at the seriousness in his tone. "When we reach Cheyenne, I have to continue with the drive to Colorado, but I'll be returning to Wyoming afterward." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I have enough saved for a small piece of land near Laramie. It's good country water, timber, grazing land. I've had my eye on it for a while." Violet listened, uncertain where this was leading, but feeling a flutter of anticipation. "What I'm trying to say," Thomas continued, taking her hands in his, "is that I'd like you to consider waiting for me in Cheyenne. And when I return, perhaps we could see if that land might be a place where both of us could build something." Violet's breath caught. "Thomas, are you asking me to..." "Not marriage," he clarified quickly. "Not yet. That would be too soon for both of us. But I'm asking if you might consider a future that includes me, that includes us building something together. He looked down at their joined hands, then back to her eyes. I know we've known each other only a short time, but I've never felt this way about anyone, Violet, not even Sarah. The sincerity in his voice touched Violet deeply. She thought of the day he had extended his hand to her in the church, offering escape when she needed it most. She thought of the weeks on the trail, his quiet strength, his kindness, his respect for her independence even as he protected her. I've been hurt before, she said softly. And so have you. It makes trusting again difficult. I know, Thomas acknowledged, and I would never rush you or press for more than you're ready to give. But I also know that sometimes life offers unexpected chances at happiness, and the brave thing is to take them. Violet smiled at his words, recognizing the wisdom in them. The brave thing, she repeated. You've been teaching me about bravery since the day we met, Thomas Everett. Is that a yes? He asked, hope lighting his eyes. It's a maybe, Violet replied honestly. A strong maybe. I need a little more time, Thomas, to be sure my heart is whole enough to offer you. Though disappointment flickered across his face, Thomas nodded in understanding. Time is something I can give you, and meanwhile, I'll do my best to prove myself worthy of your trust. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the distant mountains, Thomas gently raised one hand to Violet's cheek. May I? He asked softly. Violet nodded, her heart pounding as he leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. But she didn't want to pull away. She wanted this moment, this connection, this man who had come into her life so unexpectedly. His lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle yet filled with promise, the promise of deeper feelings, of possibilities yet to be explored, of a future that might be shared. Violet's hands moved to his shoulders as she returned the kiss, allowing herself to feel fully for the first time since her heart had been broken. When they finally parted, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky above them. Thomas rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. We should head back, he said reluctantly, before they send out a search party. Violet nodded, equally reluctant to break the spell of the moment. As they mounted their horses and began the ride back to camp, she felt a lightness in her heart that had been absent for too long. Henry's betrayal had left her wondering if she would ever trust again, ever love again. Now, riding beside Thomas under the vast starlit sky, she found her answer. The final days of the journey to Cheyenne passed in a blur of activity and anticipation. The cattle drive encountered a military patrol who warned them of tensions with a small band of Sioux in the area, leading Frank to adjust their route once again. This detour added an extra day to their journey, but kept them safely away from potential conflict. Violet and Thomas found moments to be alone together, brief walks after dinner, conversations while riding side by side during the day. Each interaction deepened their connection, strengthening Violet's growing certainty about her feelings for him. Tell me about your family, she asked one afternoon, as they rode through a stand of cottonwoods. You rarely mention them. Thomas was quiet for a moment before responding. There's not much to tell. My father died when I was 12. My mother remarried a year later, a man who made it clear he had no use for another man's son. I left home at 16, worked my way west with cattle drives. You have no siblings? Violet asked, saddened by his solitary history. A half-sister, Thomas replied, a genuine smile softening his features. Hannah. She's 17 now, living with my mother in Dallas. I send money when I can. Hope to bring her out west someday, once I have a place of my own. Violet could hear the affection in his voice when he spoke of his sister. I'd like to meet her someday, she said, then blushed at the implication of her words. Thomas's smile widened. She'd like you. She's got the same independent spirit. Their conversation was interrupted by a shout from ahead. One of the cowboys had spotted Cheyenne in the distance. A cheer went up from the men, the prospect of civilization after weeks on the trail lifting everyone's spirits. By late afternoon, they had reached the outskirts of the city. Cheyenne, in 1875, was a bustling railroad town, the Union Pacific having transformed it from a small settlement to a significant hub of commerce. The streets were busy with wagons, riders, and pedestrians, the sound of construction ever present as new buildings rose to accommodate the growing population. Frank directed the cattle to holding pens outside town while the cowboys made camp one final time. Tomorrow, most of the men would be paid and given a few days of liberty before continuing on to Colorado with the herd. Violet suddenly realized how little time remained before Thomas would have to leave. That evening, as they sat around the campfire for the last time, the mood was celebratory. Someone had procured bottles of whiskey from town, and stories and laughter flowed freely. Violet sat beside Thomas, acutely aware of his presence, of the warmth of his arm occasionally brushing against hers. "I've been thinking," she said quietly as the revelry continued around them, "about your question." Thomas turned to her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "And I want to stay in Cheyenne," Violet said. "I want to wait for you to return from Colorado." The joy that spread across Thomas's face was answer enough, but his words confirmed it. "You've made me the happiest man in Wyoming territory, Violet Vale. But," she continued, wanting to be completely honest, "I need to make my own way while you're gone. I need to know that I can stand on my own 2 feet, that whatever we build together comes from choice, not necessity." Thomas nodded, respect evident in his expression. "I wouldn't want it any other way. You're not the kind of woman who needs taking care of, Violet. You're the kind who stands as an equal partner." His understanding of her need for independence only confirmed what her heart already knew. Thomas Everett was unlike any man she had ever known, including Henry Blackstone. The next morning dawned clear and bright. The cowboys broke camp efficiently, eager to reach town and enjoy the comforts of civilization. Frank paid each man his wages, with an extra bonus for those who had performed especially well during the drive. Violet found herself suddenly uncertain. She had her trunk and the money her father had given her, but no concrete plan for where she would stay or what she would do in Cheyenne. Thomas, sensing her concern, approached with a solution. "I've spoken with Mrs. Peterson at the boarding house in town. She has a room available and is willing to consider you for a position helping with the cleaning and cooking. It would provide you with lodging and some income until you decide on your next steps." Relieved and touched by his thoughtfulness, Violet accepted the suggestion gratefully. Together, they loaded her trunk onto a wagon headed into town, then rode side by side toward Cheyenne proper. The city was both exciting and intimidating after so many weeks on the open trail. The streets were crowded, the buildings tall and substantial compared to Sweetwater Creek. Violet felt a momentary doubt. Could she really make a life here, even temporarily? Mrs. Peterson's boarding house was a tidy 2-story structure on a relatively quiet street. The proprietress herself met them at the door, a stout woman in her 50s with keen eyes that assessed Violet immediately. "So, you're the young lady Mr. Everett spoke of," she said, her tone brisk but not unfriendly. "He says you're handy in a kitchen and not afraid of hard work." "Yes, madam," Violet replied, straightening her shoulders. "I'm both those things." Mrs. Peterson nodded approvingly. "Good. I can offer room and board plus $2 a week for help with meals and keeping the place tidy. More if you prove yourself valuable." "That's very fair," Violet said, relieved at the reasonable terms. "Thank you." After helping bring Violet's trunk to her small but clean room on the 2nd floor, Thomas reluctantly explained that he needed to return to the cattle drive. They were leaving for Colorado the following morning. "I should be back within 3 weeks," he told her, as they stood in the modest front parlor of the boarding house. "A month at most." Violet nodded, already feeling the ache of their impending separation. "I'll be here. Perhaps by then I'll have a clearer idea of what I want to do next." "Whatever you decide," Thomas said, taking her hands in his. "I'll support it, even if—" He hesitated, vulnerability crossing his features. "Even if it doesn't include me." Violet squeezed his hands reassuringly. 3 weeks isn't so very long, and we've both waited longer for things that mattered less. With Mrs. Peterson discreetly occupied in another room, Thomas gently pulled Violet into his arms for a farewell kiss, one that conveyed both promise and longing, a beginning rather than an ending. "Be safe," Violet whispered as they parted. "Always," Thomas replied with a smile that didn't quite hide his reluctance to leave. "I've got more reason than ever to come back in one piece." After he had gone, Violet stood at the window watching his figure disappear down the street. A mixture of emotions swirled within her sadness at their separation, excitement at the possibilities that awaited her in Cheyenne, and a warm certainty about her feelings for the man who had changed her life by a simple act of kindness in a church doorway. The first week in Cheyenne passed quickly as Violet settled into her new role at the boarding house. Mrs. Peterson proved to be a fair employer, appreciative of Violet's cooking skills and efficient housekeeping. The boarders, mostly single men working for the railroad or local businesses, were respectful, particularly after Mrs. Peterson made it clear that Violet was under her protection. Violet used her free time to explore the city, familiarizing herself with its layout and resources. She visited shops, the small public library, and several churches, considering where she might best fit in. She wrote long letters to her parents, explaining her decision to stay in Cheyenne temporarily, and, with some trepidation, mentioning Thomas and her growing feelings for him. In the second week, an opportunity presented itself unexpectedly. While purchasing supplies for the boarding house, Violet struck up a conversation with the owner of a small apothecary shop. Mr. Harrison was an elderly man with arthritis that made it increasingly difficult for him to prepare his remedies. "You seem to know a great deal about medicinal plants, young lady," he commented after Violet had identified several dried herbs in his shop. "My grandmother taught me," Violet explained. "She was known for her remedies back home." Mr. Harrison studied her thoughtfully. "I don't suppose you'd be interested in helping me a few hours a week. My hands aren't what they used to be, and I could use someone who knows the difference between comfrey and foxglove." Violet's heart leaped at the opportunity. "I would be very interested, Mr. Harrison. Very interested indeed." With Mrs. Peterson's blessing secured by Violet's promise to continue her boarding house duties, she began working at the apothecary 3 afternoons a week. The work was fascinating and rewarding, allowing her to use knowledge she had feared might never be practical. By the beginning of the third week, Violet had established a routine that felt both productive and satisfying. She had made acquaintances, if not yet friends, found meaningful work, and begun to envision a future in this vibrant, growing city. The only piece missing was Thomas, whose absence she felt more keenly with each passing day. She had just returned to the boarding house after an afternoon at the apothecary when Mrs. Peterson met her at the door, an envelope in hand. "This came for you," the older woman said, handing Violet the letter. "From Mr. Everett, I believe." Trying to contain her excitement, Violet took the letter to her room before opening it with trembling fingers. Thomas's handwriting was neat and even, the words heartfelt. He wrote of the cattle drive to Colorado, which had proceeded without major incident. He missed her, thought of her constantly, and counted the days until his return. The cattle had been delivered, and he was in Denver finalizing the sale. He expected to start the journey back to Cheyenne within 2 days. "I've been thinking about that piece of land near Laramie," he wrote toward the end of the letter. "It's still available, and I believe I'll have enough from this drive to make a down payment. But, Violet, I want you to know that your happiness is more important to me than any plans of mine. If Cheyenne is where you wish to stay, or if you've decided on a different path entirely, I will understand. My feelings for you remain unchanged, but they come with no expectations or demands." Violet pressed the letter to her heart, moved by his understanding and respect for her independence. In the weeks since they had parted, her own feelings had only strengthened. The life she was building in Cheyenne was satisfying, but it would be infinitely more so with Thomas by her side. She sat down immediately to write a reply, knowing he might not receive it before leaving Denver, but needing to put her thoughts on paper. She told him of her work at the apothecary, her growing comfort in Cheyenne, and most importantly, her certainty about her feelings for him. "I have thought long and hard about what I want," she wrote. "The unexpected freedom that came from being left at the altar has allowed me to discover strengths and desires I never knew I possessed. I know now that I can make my own way in the world, if I choose to. But, Thomas, what I choose is a future that includes you. Whether that's in Cheyenne or Laramie or somewhere else entirely, matters far less than the fact that we would face it together." She sealed the letter and took it to the post office immediately, hoping it might reach Denver before Thomas departed. Then she returned to the boarding house to continue her duties, her heart lighter than it had been since their parting. 3 days later, Violet was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard a commotion at the front door. Mrs. Peterson's voice rose in greeting, followed by a deeper voice that made Violet's heart race. Setting down her wooden spoon, She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried toward the sound. There in the entryway stood Thomas Everett, his hat in his hands, his face breaking into a radiant smile as he caught sight of her. He looked tired from the journey, but wonderfully, gloriously real after weeks of existing only in her thoughts and dreams. "Thomas," she breathed, barely aware of Mrs. Peterson discreetly excusing herself to give them privacy. "Violet," he replied, his voice warm with emotion. "I came straight here from the stables. I couldn't wait another moment to see you." She crossed the room to him, propriety forgotten as she threw her arms around his neck. His arms encircled her waist, lifting her slightly as he held her close, his face buried in her hair. "I missed you," she whispered, pulling back just far enough to see his face. "So much." "And I you," Thomas replied, his eyes moving over her features as if memorizing them anew. "Every day, every mile." He set her gently on her feet, suddenly aware of their surroundings. "I should probably have called properly, but—" Violet silenced him with a quick kiss. "I'm glad you didn't wait." Thomas smiled, relieved by her welcome. "Did you receive my letter?" "Yes, and I wrote back," Violet told him, "though I imagine our letters crossed paths." "What did it say?" Thomas asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Your letter?" Violet took both his hands in hers, her gaze steady and sure. "It said that I've made my decision, Thomas, that I want a future with you, wherever that might be." The joy that illuminated his face was answer enough, but he spoke the words she longed to hear. "I love you, Violet Vale. I think I have since the moment you took my hand in that church." "And I love you," Violet replied, the words feeling right and true on her lips. "Perhaps not since that first moment, but certainly since long before I was willing to admit it to myself." They might have continued in this vein indefinitely had Mrs. Peterson not cleared her throat from the doorway, a knowing smile on her face. "Dinner will be served in half an hour, Mr. Everett," she announced. "You're welcome to join us, of course." Thomas accepted the invitation gratefully, and the evening passed in a blur of happiness for Violet. Sitting beside Thomas at the dinner table, feeling the occasional brush of his hand against hers, she marveled at how completely her life had transformed in the space of a few short months. After dinner, with Mrs. Peterson's permission, they sat in the parlor and talked late into the evening. Thomas shared details of his journey that hadn't fit in his letter, and Violet told him more about her work at the apothecary. "Mr. Harrison has been hinting that he might consider selling the shop eventually," she explained excitedly. "He has no children interested in taking it over, and his health is declining. I've been learning everything I can from him." "That sounds like a perfect opportunity," Thomas said, genuinely pleased for her. "You'd be wonderful at it." "The only thing is," Violet continued hesitantly, "it would mean staying in Cheyenne, at least for now." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "The land near Laramie will still be there when we're ready. What matters is that we're together." He reached for her hand, his expression earnest. "Violet, I meant what I said in my letter. Your happiness comes first." Violet squeezed his hand gratefully. "And yours matters equally to me. Perhaps we can find a solution that allows for both." As the clock struck 10, Mrs. Peterson gently reminded them of the hour. Thomas reluctantly rose to leave, promising to call again the following day. At the door, he paused, taking both of Violet's hands in his. "There's something I want to ask you," he said, his voice low with emotion. "But not yet. Not until I can do it properly." Violet's heart quickened at his implication. "I'll be here when you're ready," she assured him. The following weeks were among the happiest of Violet's life. Thomas found lodging in Cheyenne and took temporary work with a freight company while they discussed their future. They spent every free moment together, getting to know each other more deeply outside the unusual circumstances of their meeting. Violet introduced Thomas to Mr. Harrison, who took an immediate liking to the earnest young man. For his part, Thomas was impressed by Violet's knowledge and skill with the remedies, and supportive of her growing dream to eventually take over the apothecary. Together, they explored possible compromises that would allow for both their aspirations. The land near Laramie was within a day's ride of Cheyenne, not ideal, but not impossible for a couple determined to build a life together. Perhaps, they reasoned, Thomas could establish his horse ranch there, while Violet continued her work in the city, at least until Mr. Harrison was ready to sell the shop. One crisp autumn evening, about 2 months after Thomas's return from Colorado, he invited Violet for a special dinner at Cheyenne's finest restaurant. She wore her best dress, a deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and found herself unusually nervous as she prepared for the evening. Thomas called for her at the boarding house, looking handsome in a new suit. Mrs. Peterson, who had become almost motherly toward Violet, gave them both an approving smile as they departed. The restaurant was elegant by frontier standards, with white tablecloths and real glass windows overlooking the now bustling main street. Thomas had reserved a private table near the back, where they could talk without being overheard. Throughout dinner, Violet noticed that Thomas seemed slightly distracted, his hand occasionally patting his jacket pocket, as if checking that something was still there. As they finished their dessert apple pie with real cream, he took a deep breath and reached across the table for her hand. "Violet," he began, his voice steady despite the nervous flicker in his eyes. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. Meeting you even under such unusual circumstances was the greatest blessing I could have imagined." Violet felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the direction of his words. "I know we've talked about compromises, about finding ways to pursue both our dreams," Thomas continued, "but I've come to realize that my only real dream is a life with you, whatever shape that takes." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, then moved from his chair to kneel beside her. Several diners nearby noticed and fell silent, watching the scene unfold. "Violet Vale," Thomas said, opening the box to reveal a simple but beautiful ring with a small diamond flanked by 2 sapphires. "Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of happiness filled Violet's eyes as she looked from the ring to the face of the man she loved. There was no hesitation in her heart, no doubt clouding her mind. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, Thomas Everett, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, perfectly sized, she noted with wonder the restaurant erupted in spontaneous applause. Thomas rose to his feet, lifting Violet from her chair to embrace her, his joy mirroring her own. "I love you," he whispered against her ear, holding her close. "And I love you," she replied, marveling at how different this moment felt from her engagement to Henry. There was no uncertainty, no sense of following a predetermined path. This choice was fully hers, made with clear eyes and an open heart. As they walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, the stars brilliant overhead in the clear Wyoming sky, Violet felt a profound sense of rightness. The path that had brought her here had been unexpected and at times painful, but she wouldn't change a moment of it. "I've been thinking," Thomas said as they strolled, "about the land near Laramie and your work at the apothecary." "And," Violet prompted, curious about his thoughts. "What if we did both?" he suggested. "I could start smaller, with less land closer to Cheyenne. We could live in town while you continue learning from Mr. Harrison, and I could ride out to the ranch as needed." Violet considered his proposal. "You'd do that? Adjust your dream for me?" Thomas stopped walking, turning to face her under the glow of a street lamp. "It wouldn't be adjusting my dream, Violet. It would be expanding it to include yours. That's what partnership means, isn't it?" Violet's heart swelled with love for this man, who understood her so completely. "Yes," she agreed, "that's exactly what it means, and I'd be willing to adjust too. Perhaps once the apothecary is established, we could look at land closer to Laramie after all." Thomas smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We'll figure it out together, one step at a time." As they continued their walk, planning their future with excited voices and intertwined hands, Violet thought back to that moment in the church when it had seemed her world was ending. How wrong she had been. It hadn't been an ending at all, but rather the beginning of a journey that had led her exactly where she was meant to be, beside a man who loved her for her strength rather than despite it, building a future based on mutual respect and shared dreams. Their wedding took place the following spring, a simple but joyful ceremony in Cheyenne's small Episcopal church. Violet's parents traveled from Sweetwater Creek for the occasion. Her father walking her down the aisle with proud tears in his eyes. Her mother, initially skeptical of the match, had been won over by Thomas's obvious devotion to her daughter and Violet's undeniable happiness. Standing before the altar where vows would be exchanged, Violet felt not a trace of the doubt or anxiety that had plagued her first attempted wedding. Instead, as she met Thomas's steady gaze, she felt only certainty and love. The minister smiled as he addressed the congregation. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Thomas Everett and Violet Vale in holy matrimony." As they exchanged their vows, Violet thought of the strange and winding path that had brought her to this moment. Being left at the altar had seemed like the end of her dreams, a public humiliation from which she might never recover. Instead, it had been the beginning of a journey toward a love deeper and truer than she had ever imagined possible. Thomas's hands were warm and steady as he placed the wedding ring on her finger. "With this ring, I thee wed," he said, his voice clear and certain. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. The cheers of their friends and family faded into the background as they shared this moment that belonged only to them. "Ready for our new adventure, Mrs. Everett?" Thomas whispered as they turned to face the congregation. Violet's heart soared at the name and all it represented. "With you, always," she replied, her hand firmly in his as they walked back down the aisle together. Outside the church, the Wyoming spring sunshine blessed them with its warmth. The journey that had begun with a bride left at the altar and a cowboy who offered his hand before she could cry had come full circle not to an ending but to a new beginning filled with promise, partnership, and love that would endure through all the seasons of their lives.